There are nights when the mind feels crowded, and even the smallest thought can echo like a footstep in an empty hall. If you let your breathing slow, the room begins to soften at the edges, and the present becomes less demanding. Imagine the world outside your walls growing quieter, as if the planet itself is lowering its voice. Streets and screens and schedules fade, replaced by older sounds you do not have to interpret. Wind in grass, water moving over stone. Some stories are not meant to be chased. They are meant to be entered gently, like warm darkness. Tonight, we are not searching for proof or victory. We are walking toward a question that has waited a very long time to be asked calmly. And as you listen, you can let the ancient past do what it does best. It makes the modern world feel brief, and it reminds you that memory can be older than history. The first thing you notice if you stand in the mind of deep time is how the world changes without asking anyone's permission. Ice withdraws, rivers rearrange themselves, coastlines move like slow breathing, and what feels permanent becomes temporary with quiet certainty. The human story begins there, not with a date, but with the long exhale of a thaw. If you feel drawn to these late-night journeys, you can subscribe, like leaving a small lantern in the window for the nights when you want to return to the same calm mysteries again. In what we call 10,000 BC, the planet was waking from a frozen age that had lasted longer than any lineage could remember. The air was wet with meltwater and new vegetation. Herds followed routes that shifted each season. People followed the herds. They carried their lives on their backs and their knowledge in their bodies, in the way they read wind, tracked prints, and listened for weather before it arrived. And then, in a place that should have been just another hill, something happened that still feels like a mistake in the timeline. In southeastern Anatolia, on a rise that would later be named Göbekli Tepe, human hands shaped stone into an idea. Not a hut, not a fence, not a practical wall. A sanctuary, circles, great pillars, carved animals frozen mid-motion, as if the rock itself had learned how to remember. The unsettling part is not simply that it exists. It is that it appears already confident. The pillars are massive, taller than a person, heavier than a crowd could easily move. The carvings are controlled, not tentative. The site feels planned, not improvised. And if you let the mind linger there, you begin to sense the deeper disturbance. It is as if the world expected humanity to take small steps, and instead it found footprints that look like strides. In the quiet between those stones, the question begins to form without force. What kind of inner world builds an outer world like this? What kind of memory tells a wandering people to raise a monument to the sky? And what did they think was listening above them, in the stars that were returning to a changing earth? Those stars, returning to a changing earth, are part of what makes the hill feel less like a place and more like a message. Because the builders did not carve randomly. They carved with the patience of people who believed that time itself could be addressed. If you have ever tried to leave a note for your future self, you know the impulse. You do not want to be misunderstood. You choose your words carefully. At Göbekli Tepe, the words are animals and angles. The pillars stand like simplified human figures, broad at the top, narrow through the body, as if the stone itself is wearing a cloak. Some show hands and belts, small details that pull the mind toward an unsettling possibility. These are not just supports. They are presences. And around them, the reliefs repeat with a kind of insistence. Foxes, boars, snakes, vultures, scorpions, creatures that belong to land and fear and transformation. A vulture is not an innocent symbol. It eats what remains. It cleans the boundary between life and death. In later cultures, vultures appear in rituals that touch the soul, in images of sky burial, in stories where the body becomes a gift to the air. When a vulture is carved into a pillar older than writing, you can feel the human mind reaching for a way to speak about endings. There is one pillar, famous now, that draws the eye like a confession. Symbols arranged in a way that invites mapping. Shapes that some researchers interpret as a record of the sky, a moment in the heavens turned into stone. If you accept that possibility even briefly, you begin to feel what the builders might have felt. A sky that can change, a sky that can hurt, a sky that can erase the familiar. Because the end of the Ice Age was not only warmth, it was instability. Water was rising, weather was unpredictable. The world was rearranging itself. And if you lived close to coasts or river mouths, you might have watched land disappear year by year. You would have learned that the earth can take back what it once offered. So a sanctuary on a hill starts to feel like more than faith. It starts to feel like a response, a decision to anchor meaning somewhere that floods cannot easily reach. And as that thought settles, another question rises with it. If these stones were built as an answer to catastrophe, what catastrophe were they answering? What catastrophe were they answering is not a question that lives comfortably inside tidy timelines. It leaks outward, touching geology, myth, and the strange way human beings keep the same stories in different languages. The further back you look, the more flood narratives appear, as if water is not only a physical memory, but a psychological one. A world erased, a remnant saved. A new beginning built on what survived. Modern science has names for sudden climate shifts near the end of the last ice age. One of them is the Younger Dryas, a period when temperatures dropped sharply after warming had begun, like a door closing when everyone expected it to stay open. The cause is debated, but the effect in human terms would have felt like betrayal. Seasons that no longer obey, animals that vanish. Hunger arriving early. The kind of uncertainty that changes the way a mind thinks about the sky. In that atmosphere, a site like Göbekli Tepe stops looking like a casual invention. It looks like a decision made under pressure, guided by people who believed they had to preserve something. Not only food, not only shelter, a pattern, a map, a set of relationships between earth and heaven that could survive chaos. And then you notice the strangest detail of all. The site was not simply abandoned, it was filled in, buried deliberately, layer upon layer, as if the builders were closing a door behind them. They entombed their own work. That act carries an eerie tenderness, like covering a sleeping child or sealing a relic away until the world is ready. Why bury a sanctuary? The practical answers are not enough. Weather, conflict, social change. Those might explain leaving. They do not explain the careful covering, the sense of ritual closure. Burial suggests intention. It suggests that the site was designed to be found later, or at least to be protected from time, in a way ordinary abandonment would not accomplish. And once you allow that thought, the hill begins to resemble a kind of container, a vessel of memory. A message in a bottle, except the bottle is Earth itself. The builders may have believed that knowledge can outlast people if it is stored in the right material. Stone, packed under soil, held away from weather and war. If so, Göbekli Tepe becomes a bridge between worlds. Not between nations, but between epochs. Between a humanity that witnessed something terrible and a humanity that would grow up in the echo of it. And quietly, the idea begins to take shape. Perhaps the builders were not inventing civilization. Perhaps they were trying to rebuild it. Trying to rebuild it is a phrase that changes everything because it suggests there was something to rebuild from. And that is the forbidden thought that hovers near every megalith older than expectation. The mind wants to ask whether an earlier chapter existed, one that did not survive in texts, because texts did not survive the water. The sea level at the end of the Ice Age rose dramatically over thousands of years. What had been wide coastal plains became continental shelves, places where people could have lived, fished, built, and buried their dead are now underwater. If you imagine the map of the world then, you begin to see how much potential history is missing. Not hidden in a library, but dissolved in salt. There is a certain kind of grief in that thought. Most of what humans do leaves no durable mark. A woven basket, a wooden post, a song. Even bones can disappear in acidic soil. Stone endures. And so the past becomes biased toward what was heavy, what was carved, what could not float away. Now consider what it would mean if a community lived through the rising water, if their shore became a memory, if their ancestors' graves vanished under waves, if familiar landmarks drowned. They might move inland, upward, toward safer ground. They might carry stories of the lost coast, and those stories could harden into myth. A sunken homeland, a garden swallowed, a warning about hubris or neglect, a god who decides to cleanse. In that light, the later legends of drowned places begin to feel less like pure invention and more like emotional geology. Atlantis, for example, is not evidence of a specific city, but it is evidence of a human obsession with submergence, with the idea that a world can vanish quickly. Across cultures, this obsession repeats. A flood resets the order. Survivors become founders. Knowledge becomes sacred because it was nearly lost. Göbekli Tepe sits like a hinge at that threshold. It is inland, elevated, and ancient enough to stand near the boundary between the thaw and the rise. If its builders were descendants of people displaced by water, their decision to build high and in stone makes a kind of simple sense. They were choosing permanence in a world that had proven impermanent. And still, the question of knowledge remains. How did they coordinate labor? How did they quarry and transport? How did they conceive a plan that could be carried out over years? Even if the technology was simple, the organization was not. It implies a shared purpose strong enough to override daily survival. So the possibility shifts. The site could be both sanctuary and school, a place where the community rehearsed what it meant to be human again, after a world had changed. A place where the sky was watched, not out of idle curiosity, but because the sky had once delivered consequences. And in the quiet of that watching, another thread begins to appear. The same impulse to align with the heavens shows up elsewhere, as if someone or something taught the early human mind to measure time by stars. To measure time by stars is to admit that time is not only personal, it is cosmic. It belongs to cycles larger than any village, larger than any lifetime. When people begin to build with the sky in mind, they are doing more than worship. They are creating a calendar of meaning, a way to place themselves inside the universe rather than beneath it. At Göbekli Tepe, whatever the precise alignments were, the intent feels directional. The architecture does not close itself off from the heavens. It frames them. The circles are open. The pillars stand like markers, and the repeated animals, fierce and watchful, feel like guardians of a boundary between worlds. Later civilizations will do the same. Egypt will point pyramids toward the imperishable stars. Mesopotamia will raise temple towers as artificial mountains. In the Americas, pyramids will catch equinox light like a ritual blade. The pattern is global, and that is what makes the earliest example so haunting. The earliest example should be clumsy. It is not. You can interpret this in many ways without forcing certainty. One possibility is that human cognition can leap, that complex behavior can emerge quickly when conditions allow. Another possibility is inheritance. Knowledge passed through oral tradition can be precise, especially when it is tied to ritual. A community can remember the sky if it ties the sky to survival. But there is a third possibility that lives in the space between myth and archaeology. The ancient world often speaks of teachers. In Sumer, sages. In Egypt, divine measurers. In the Andes, culture heroes who arrive after a flood and teach stonework and agriculture. If these stories are not literal, they may still preserve a social truth. Certain individuals or groups held specialized knowledge. They traveled, they instructed, they shaped new societies by carrying old methods. In the Near East, the emergence of settled life and cultivation is often described as a revolution. Yet revolutions usually have roots. They are prepared by prior experimentation, by pressure, by memory. A group that has lost a homeland may become unusually motivated to stabilize, to domesticate plants, to store grain, to build durable structures. In that sense, the so-called revolution could be a reaction to catastrophe rather than a sudden whim. And then there is the buried nature of Göbekli Tepe again, calling back like a refrain. It is not just built, it is sealed. That act feels like a decision made by people who understood cycles, people who believed there are times to reveal and times to hide, times to gather and times to scatter. If the builders believed another disruption could come, then a buried sanctuary becomes a kind of insurance policy for the future, a place the earth itself guards until humans are ready to listen, not ready technologically, but ready psychologically, ready to accept that the past might be stranger than the neat story of gradual progress. And when that possibility settles, the hill stops being isolated. It becomes the first visible stone in a path that leads outward, to other sites nearby, and then farther to other continents, where the same quiet confidence appears in rock, as if the impulse to build with heaven in mind spread like a seed, carried by survivors, carried by time, carried by the need to remember. That need to remember is the invisible fuel of early civilization, more powerful than hunger in certain moments, because hunger can be satisfied. But forgetting feels like death. When a people believes it has lost a world, it may build not to impress the gods, but to prevent the soul from dissolving into silence. Near Göbekli Tepe, other sites begin to surface, each with its own atmosphere, each insisting that the hill was not an anomaly. Karahan Tepe, for example, reveals similar pillars and chambers and the feeling of a shared cultural language. The imagery shifts, but the grammar remains. Stone circles, carved beings, a mind that prefers permanence. When multiple sites appear in a region, the story changes. It becomes less likely that a single group had a single inspiration. It suggests a broader tradition, a landscape of sanctuaries that may have functioned like nodes in a network of ritual and gathering. People could move between them seasonally, bringing stories and marriages and knowledge, reinforcing a common worldview. And that worldview seems preoccupied with thresholds, animals that hunt, animals that scavenge, creatures that strike from the dark. These are not gentle pastoral symbols. They feel like reminders that the world is dangerous, that life and death are close, that chaos is never far. If a cataclysm had recently scarred the collective memory, these carvings could be the emotional residue of it. There is also a strange intimacy in the way the stones humanize the non-human. The animal forms are not crude. They are attentive. They contain personality. This implies long observation and a deep relationship with the living world. A culture that sees animals as signs, as messengers, as parts of a cosmic story. In later mythologies, the same animals become constellations. Scorpio in the sky, the serpent as a river of stars, the bird as a soul carrier. The line between zoology and astronomy blurs. That blur might be exactly the point. If you cannot write, you encode. You place meaning in images that can be retold. So imagine a night gathering, fires low. A storyteller gestures toward a pillar. The vulture becomes a lesson about endings. The serpent becomes a lesson about renewal. The scorpion becomes a lesson about the sting of sudden change. Above them, the same shapes appear in the sky. The mind links earth and heaven, stone and star, memory and warning. This is how knowledge can survive without paper. It survives as an experience, a pattern of perception, a choreography of stories tied to a place. A sanctuary becomes a mnemonic device, a memory palace made of limestone. And if that is true, then Göbekli Tepe is not a mystery because it is advanced. It is a mystery because it is deliberate. It shows intention to transmit something across time, and intention implies that the builders felt the future would need what they knew. What did they know? Perhaps they knew only that the world can change quickly. Perhaps they knew how to read the sky well enough to track seasons. Or perhaps they knew something deeper, a larger rhythm, a cycle that returns. The thought is quiet but persistent. If the sky once brought disaster, then the sky might do so again. And that possibility, once planted, grows into the oldest kind of science. The science of watching. The science of watching begins as fear and becomes discipline. You watch the horizon for weather. You watch animal movement for signs of winter. You watch the stars because the stars do not lie, even when the earth does. They return in patterns, and patterns are a form of comfort. Over enough generations, watching becomes measurement. Measurement becomes prediction. Prediction becomes power. Not power over nature, but power to anticipate, to prepare, to reduce surprise. In a world newly unstable after the Ice Age, the value of anticipation would have felt sacred. This is where the boundary between priest and astronomer begins to blur. In early societies, the person who knows when the rains come and when the sun turns is not merely a thinker. They are a guardian of survival. Their knowledge becomes ritual because ritual keeps it accurate. It ensures repetition. It ensures transmission. At Göbekli Tepe, the repeated forms and the careful placement could reflect that kind of repeated teaching. The sanctuary as calendar, the pillar as reminder, the carvings as vocabulary. Even if we cannot decode every symbol, we can feel the intention to create a stable map inside the human mind. And yet, there is still the lingering discomfort of scale. These are not small teaching tools. They are massive. They require coordination. They require a community willing to contribute labor beyond immediate need. That means the knowledge being preserved was valued enough to justify exhaustion. What kind of knowledge earns that devotion? In many later cultures, it is the knowledge of cycles, the idea that time is not a straight line, but a wheel. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow shifting of the sky over thousands of years, is one such cycle, and it is difficult to measure without writing and long records. But early humans were not incapable of long memory. Oral traditions can preserve data for surprisingly long spans, especially when embedded in ceremony. Still, the idea of precession at such an early date is controversial and uncertain. We do not need to assert it as fact to feel the narrative possibility. The builders might have sensed long cycles without quantifying them. They might have noticed that certain stars rose slightly differently than their grandparents described. They might have felt that heaven itself drifts. If you live close to the land, you also notice that Earth drifts. Rivers change course. Lakes expand and shrink. Forest edges move. The end of the Ice Age would have amplified that awareness. The world was no longer stable enough to be ignored. In that context, a sanctuary built on a hill becomes a statement. Here is something that will not move. Here is a fixed point in a moving world. And then you remember again that they buried it. A fixed point that they chose to hide. That choice suggests a story with chapters, not a single moment. Build, use, seal, leave. It feels like a ritual cycle of its own, echoing a belief that time turns. that knowledge must sometimes descend into the earth to survive. In later traditions, the underworld is not only a place of death, it is a place of gestation. Seeds sleep underground before they rise. The sun travels through darkness before dawn. A buried sanctuary could be an intentional underworld, a womb of memory. If so, then the act of burial is not defeat. It is preparation. And that preparation hints that the builders understood something about the future. Not specific events, but recurrence. That the conditions that produced their fear and their devotion could return. And that when it did, someone would need a guide. A set of stones waiting under the soil, patient as the planet, ready to be found by minds capable of asking the right questions. Those right questions do not arrive all at once. They arrive slowly, the way dawn arrives. First you ask how, then you ask why, and eventually you ask who, not as a search for a name, but as a search for a kind of human being, a kind of consciousness capable of building for an unseen audience 12,000 years away. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe is not only an archaeological site, it is a psychological mirror. It reflects a mind that believes in continuity, that believes meaning can survive catastrophe, that believes the future will matter enough to be addressed. If we widen the view, we begin to see that the late Ice Age and early Neolithic world was not empty. It was full of small societies, each with its own customs and roots, each learning the new rules of a warming planet. Some were experimenting with cultivation. Some were gathering wild grains. Some were building semi-permanent settlements. The world was in transition, and transitions often produce innovation. But innovation is not always born from comfort. Sometimes it is born from loss. When a world disappears, the survivors become obsessed with preserving the fragments. They ritualize what mattered. They elevate what saved them. They carve their warnings into whatever will last. This might explain why the earliest monumental architecture is often sacred rather than domestic. Before the first palaces, there are sanctuaries. Before bureaucracies, there are rituals. It is as if the human need to orient itself in the cosmos arrives before the human need to organize taxes or armies. And that is where the story begins to open into a larger arc. Because once sanctuaries exist, they change people. They create shared identities. They invite gatherings. They require coordination. They encourage settlement. In that way, the temple can become the seed of the city, not the other way around. If Göbekli Tepe helped pull communities together, it might have accelerated the shift toward agriculture and permanent life. Not because farming was inevitable, but because a gathering place creates demand. Food storage becomes necessary. Seasonal planning becomes vital. Leadership structures emerge. The sanctuary becomes a magnet, and around the magnet, a new social world forms. This is an unsettling reversal of the usual narrative, and it carries a deeper implication. If spiritual architecture helped birth civilization, then civilization itself may have begun as an act of remembrance, a response to a shock, a desire to anchor human life to something larger than weather and hunger. And if that is true in Anatolia, it may be true elsewhere. Across the world, in different times, humans build upward and align to the sky, as if reenacting a memory they cannot fully explain. Pyramids, circles, mounds, temples, different materials, same impulse. The planet begins to look like it has been marked by one repeating idea. The question then changes. It is no longer only about a single hill in Turkey. It becomes about a pattern of human consciousness, a recurring architecture of the mind. Why do we keep building the sky into stone? Why do we keep returning to certain symbols, certain animals, certain stars? And as that question deepens, it invites us into a wider darkness, not the darkness of ignorance, but the darkness of the unseen chapters, the drowned coastlines, the erased settlements, the stories that survived only as myth because the sea does not keep libraries. If there was a world before memory, then perhaps Göbekli Tepe was built at the moment memory decided it would no longer trust water or time to carry the truth. Memory deciding it would no longer trust water or time is a quiet turning point in the human story. From that moment on, the past no longer floats freely behind us. It is anchored, weighted, pressed into the ground with intention. Stone becomes not only material, but strategy. Once you see it that way, the late Ice Age world feels less primitive and more cautious. These were not people stumbling blindly into civilization. They were people who had learned, perhaps painfully, that the world can erase itself. And when erasure becomes part of lived experience, preservation becomes sacred. This may explain why the earliest monumental sites feel emotionally heavy rather than celebratory. There is awe in them, yes, but also restraint. Göbekli Tepe does not boast. It does not proclaim dominance. It watches. Its pillars stand inward, facing one another, as if the most important dialogue was never meant for outsiders. The message is enclosed, protected, turned toward itself. That inward focus suggests initiation rather than spectacle. A space designed to shape perception, to alter how the mind understands its place in time. You do not enter such a space to be entertained. You enter to be reminded. And reminded of what? Possibly of a boundary between order and chaos, between cycles that nourish and cycles that destroy. The animal carvings may represent forces rather than creatures, instincts rather than prey. The fox, clever and elusive. The serpent, renewal and danger intertwined. The scorpion, sudden consequence. These are lessons etched into permanence. In later civilizations, the same symbolic vocabulary reappears, often attached to gods or cosmic principles. But here, at the threshold of agriculture and cities, the symbols are still close to the ground. They have not yet been abstracted into theology. They are warnings and reminders rather than commandments. This grounding matters. It suggests that whatever knowledge was being preserved had not yet drifted into hierarchy. It belonged to the group, not to a ruler. There is no throne at Göbekli Tepe, no palace, no indication of kingship. The authority here seems collective, or at least ritual rather than political. That detail alone separates this site from later monumental traditions. Power has not yet claimed the sacred. The sacred stands on its own, heavy and silent. But this balance does not last forever. As populations grow and settlement becomes stable, memory begins to specialize. Certain people become its carriers. Others become producers. The division of labor appears, and with it the division of knowledge. What was once shared experience becomes guarded understanding. Göbekli Tepe may sit just before that shift, or exactly at its edge. A place where memory was still communal but already felt fragile enough to require stone. And fragility implies foresight. These builders were not only responding to what had happened, they were anticipating what could happen again. The earth had shown its capacity for disruption. Ice had retreated. Waters had risen. The sky had changed its behavior. Nothing guaranteed stability. In that atmosphere, watching the heavens takes on a different tone. Not curiosity, but vigilance. If the sky once brought catastrophe, then the sky must be monitored. Patterns must be learned. Signs must be recognized early. This is how cosmology can grow out of survival rather than philosophy. The stars become more than distant lights. They become indicators, messengers, a slow-moving script written above a restless planet. And so, the sanctuary becomes a classroom without walls, a place where the long rhythms of the sky are tied to the shorter rhythms of human life, where children grow up knowing that time is layered, that what happened once can happen again, and that memory is the only defense against repetition. As this awareness deepens, it begins to reshape how humans see themselves. Not as masters of the land, but as participants in cycles they do not control. This humility is rarely credited to early societies, yet it may be the very reason they endured. But humility does not prevent forgetting. Over generations, stories blur, details soften, symbols outlast explanations, and eventually, what began as lived memory becomes myth. The question is not whether this transformation happened. It always does. The question is whether something of the original understanding survived intact, carried quietly through time, waiting for a world capable of hearing it again. Because if Göbekli Tepe represents a moment when memory hardened into stone, then what follows is not a straight ascent into civilization, but a long negotiation between remembering and forgetting. And somewhere along that path, the original warning embedded in those pillars may have been translated, diluted, or misunderstood. To trace that path, we must follow memory as it migrates, not just through sights and symbols, but through human minds themselves, as they spread outward from this changing landscape into a world that was still learning how to exist after the ice withdrew. As memory migrates, it rarely travels intact. It fractures, adapts, disguises itself to survive new climates and new minds. What begins as lived experience slowly becomes story, then symbol, then ritual. Each transformation preserves something, but never everything. From the hills of Anatolia, people moved outward as generations passed. Some followed animals, others followed water, some stayed near the sanctuaries, while others carried fragments of their meaning into new territories. Memory did not remain centralized. It dispersed, like embers carried from a single fire into many distant hearths. This dispersion changes the nature of knowledge. When a group is small and closely tied to a place, meaning is reinforced by repetition. The land itself teaches. But when people move, they must carry memory internally. They compress it. They turn it into stories that can be told anywhere, symbols that can be recognized without stone. This may be the moment when myth is born, not as fantasy, but as compression, a way to carry complex observations about the world in forms light enough to survive migration. Flood stories, sky beings, cycles of destruction and renewal. These are not entertainment. They are memory simplified so it can travel. As these stories spread, they encounter new landscapes. Mountains replace plains, rivers replace coasts. The details shift, but the structure remains. A great change, a survival, a teaching, a warning. The same skeleton appears beneath different cultural skins. Meanwhile, in places where settlement becomes stable again, memory begins to crystallize. Stone returns, but it returns altered. The earliest sanctuaries are communal and inward-facing. Later monuments grow taller, more hierarchical, more visible. Memory starts to serve power as much as preservation. Yet even in these later forms, the older impulse lingers. Alignments persist. Sacred geometry reappears. The sky remains the ultimate reference point. It is as if, no matter how complex society becomes, it cannot fully let go of the sense that meaning comes from above and beyond human control. This persistence suggests that the original experience, whatever it was, left a deep imprint. Not a single event, perhaps, but a prolonged era of instability that trained the human mind to think in cycles, to expect recurrence, to fear complacency. The transition into agriculture reinforces this mindset. Farming ties survival to seasons. Seasons tie survival to the sun. The sun ties survival to the sky. Time becomes something that must be tracked carefully, not guessed. Calendars emerge. Rituals anchor planting and harvest. The heavens become a clock everyone must obey. And once time becomes measurable, it becomes symbolic. Solstices and equinoxes are no longer just astronomical moments. They become thresholds, gates, points of vulnerability and renewal. Many later monuments will mark these moments precisely, as if reminding humanity that balance depends on attention. Göbekli Tepe may not mark these events with mathematical clarity as later sites do, but its existence implies the same instinct: to build in dialogue with time, to acknowledge forces larger than the human will. Over generations, as the original catastrophe recedes into deep past, the reason for this vigilance may fade. But the structures remain. People continue to watch the sky because their ancestors taught them to, even if they no longer remember why. This is how wisdom becomes tradition. And tradition, when detached from its origin, can become rigid. The warning survives, but its urgency dulls. The lesson turns into ceremony. The memory turns into authority. Still, beneath the layers of ritual and hierarchy, something remains quietly intact, a sense that the world is not stable by default, that order is temporary, that harmony must be maintained consciously or it dissolves. This intuition will resurface again and again across history, especially in moments of collapse. Civilizations fall, and survivors retell stories of golden ages lost to disaster. Each time, the same structure returns, as if humanity is circling a truth it can sense but never fully hold. If we trace that circling carefully, we begin to see that Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly frozen in time. It is an early expression of a pattern that will repeat wherever humans feel both awe and fear toward the forces that shape their world. To follow that pattern further, we must leave Anatolia and watch how memory behaves when it encounters power, hierarchy, and the first true cities, places where the sacred is no longer only remembered, but governed. When memory encounters power, it changes tone. What was once a shared inheritance becomes a resource, something that can legitimize authority and stabilize large populations. The sacred does not disappear. It is reorganized. The first true cities rise near rivers that flood and retreat with unnerving regularity. The Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile. These waters nourish, but they also destroy. Living beside them requires prediction, coordination, and trust in those who claim to understand the rhythms of nature. Memory, once communal, now begins to concentrate in specialists. Priests appear before kings, not as rulers but as interpreters. They read the sky. They measure shadows. They announce when to plant and when to prepare. Their authority is quiet at first, rooted in usefulness. But usefulness quickly becomes power when survival depends on it. This is the moment when cosmology hardens into theology. The sky is no longer only observed. It is personified. Forces become beings. Patterns become wills. What was once a lesson about cycles becomes a story about gods who decide when floods come and when droughts end. Yet even as names change, the underlying structure remains. The heavens are still the source of order. The earth is still a reflection. Architecture continues to align upward, even as it grows more vertical, more imposing. Ziggurats rise like artificial mountains, stairways for ritual ascent. Pyramids appear, not only as tombs, but as statements of cosmic alignment. These structures feel different from Göbekli Tepe, and yet they echo it. Where the earlier sanctuary faced inward, later monuments face outward. They declare. They dominate the horizon. They tell populations where to look, who mediates the sky, and who holds the keys to time. This shift is not necessarily corruption. It may be inevitability. Large societies require coordination, and coordination requires shared narratives. The danger is not hierarchy itself, but forgetting why the hierarchy was formed. In many early texts, kings claim divine ancestry or appointment. This is not only propaganda, it is continuity reinterpreted. The original teachers, the ones who understood cycles and alignment, become remembered as gods. Their successors become their descendants. Authority is inherited, even as understanding fades. Flood myths proliferate during this era, appearing in written form for the first time. They describe a world undone by water, a chosen survivor, and a renewal guided by divine instruction. These stories feel distant from Göbekli Tepe in time, but emotionally they are close. They carry the same fear, the same reverence for survival, the same sense that knowledge must be preserved through catastrophe. The difference is subtle but profound. In the older stone sanctuaries, the warning feels collective. In the later texts, it becomes selective. One family survives, one king is chosen, one line carries memory forward. The lesson narrows. As cities grow, specialization deepens. Astronomy becomes astrology. Observation becomes divination. The sky is no longer only measured, it is consulted. This introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity invites control. If signs can be interpreted in many ways, then those who interpret them gain leverage. Still, even under layers of authority, the ancient anxiety persists. Calendars remain central. Temples are rebuilt again and again on the same foundations, as if location itself holds power. Sacred numbers repeat. Alignments are preserved with obsessive care. Why such insistence if the meaning were purely symbolic? Because somewhere beneath the ceremony, there remains a quiet conviction that these patterns matter. That alignment is not decoration, but necessity. That to drift too far from the rhythm of the heavens invites imbalance. In this way, early civilizations become custodians of something they only partially understand. They preserve forms long after the original context has dissolved. They repeat rituals whose origins are lost, trusting that repetition itself has protective value. Göbekli Tepe may represent the moment before this forgetting began, a time when memory was still close to experience, when symbols had not yet hardened into doctrine. Its silence feels different because it has no scripture, no priesthood, no king, only stone and intention, and perhaps that is why it unsettles us more than later monuments. It confronts us with a version of humanity that acted with foresight but without hierarchy, with reverence but without empire. A humanity that built not to rule but to remember. As we move deeper into the age of cities, the question shifts again. What happens when memory is preserved too well, when it becomes rigid and resists adaptation? What happens when the warning turns into destiny, and fear of collapse begins to shape every decision? To understand that tension, we must follow memory further into myth, where it becomes cosmic, where floods become world endings, and where the cycle of destruction and renewal expands beyond Earth into the stars themselves. When memory expands into myth, it gains scale. What was once a regional catastrophe becomes a cosmic event. The flood no longer belongs to one valley or one people. It becomes the story of the world itself resetting, as if earth and sky conspired to begin again. This expansion serves a purpose. As societies grow larger and more complex, memory must grow broader to remain relevant. A local warning no longer binds distant populations. A universal story does. And so the disaster is lifted from geography and placed into the structure of the cosmos. In these myths, the sky is no longer just a backdrop. It becomes an actor. Stars fall, suns burn too close. Gods argue, withdraw, or cleanse. Humanity is recast as a participant in a drama far larger than villages or rivers. The lesson is no longer only about survival, It is about alignment with forces that transcend human control. This is where time itself begins to stretch. The past becomes unimaginably distant. Ages are counted not in generations, but in eras. Before the flood, after the flood, before the gods withdrew, after humanity was left to govern itself. These divisions are not chronological in the modern sense. They are psychological boundaries, markers of rupture. Yet beneath the grandeur, the same anxiety persists. The fear that the order we inhabit is temporary, that harmony once broken requires effort to restore, that forgetting carries consequences. Many ancient cultures speak of previous worlds destroyed by fire, water, wind, or darkness. These are not random elements. They are expressions of imbalance. Too much heat, too much water, too much motion, too much absence. Each myth encodes a different failure to maintain equilibrium. What is striking is how often these stories insist that humanity was not ignorant before destruction. It was advanced, powerful, confident. The fall comes not from weakness, but from excess. Knowledge outpaces wisdom. Control replaces reverence. This motif appears so consistently that it begins to feel less like moralizing and more like memory, as if some early societies experienced not only environmental collapse, but collapse amplified by their own actions. Overhunting, deforestation, settlement in vulnerable zones. The myths compress these behaviors into archetypes of hubris. In that light, the builders of early sanctuaries appear less naive. They may have understood that intelligence alone does not save a species. Awareness does. Balance does. And balance must be taught continuously, not assumed. Göbekli Tepe's lack of overt dominant symbols may reflect this understanding. There is no king carved larger than others, no scene of conquest. The animals are not trophies. They are forces, equals in the drama of survival. As myth grows more elaborate in later cultures, this humility often fades. Gods become anthropomorphic. Conflicts mirror human politics. The cosmos becomes a projection of empire. Yet the older layers remain embedded, like bedrock beneath newer cities. If we listen carefully, we can still hear them. In the insistence on cycles, in the fear of divine withdrawal, in the belief that the heavens can signal catastrophe before it arrives. These ideas did not emerge from idle imagination. They feel trained, earned. The question then becomes unavoidable. If early humans were so preoccupied with cycles of destruction and renewal, what convinced them that such cycles were real? Observation alone can explain some of it. Seasonal change, floodplains, volcanic eruptions. But the scale of the myths suggests something larger, something that threatened the continuity of the world itself. To approach that possibility, we must look not only at stories, but at the physical record left in Earth's own memory, the scars that suggest the planet has indeed experienced sudden and violent changes that would have felt apocalyptic to those who lived through them. The Earth remembers differently than humans do. It does not tell stories. It records pressure, heat, absence. Its memory is layered, compressed into ice cores, sediment, and stone. And when scientists began to read those layers, a disturbing pattern emerged. The end of the last ice age was not smooth. It was punctuated. Sudden temperature drops, abrupt warming, massive releases of meltwater, events that unfolded not over millennia, but within generations, sometimes within lifetimes. For a species that measures stability in seasons, this would have felt like chaos. Around the time humans were building early sanctuaries, the planet experienced one of these shocks. Evidence suggests widespread wildfires, shifts in ocean circulation, and rapid sea level rise. Entire ecosystems reorganized. Species vanished. Coastlines retreated. To someone living through it, there would have been no context, no framework to understand why the sky seemed different, why rains came at the wrong time, why familiar lands disappeared. Only the sensation that the world had broken its agreement. This is the kind of experience that imprints deeply, not as data, but as meaning. It teaches that nature is not gentle by default, that it contains thresholds, that when certain limits are crossed, change accelerates beyond control. If early humans lived through even part of such an event, their descendants would inherit more than genes. They would inherit caution, stories that exaggerate to ensure survival, rituals that slow behavior, taboos that prevent overreach. Stone architecture in this context becomes a stabilizing act. To build something enduring in an unstable world is to assert continuity against evidence to the contrary. It is a declaration that memory will not dissolve as easily as land. Göbekli Tepe's builders may not have understood climate mechanisms, but they did not need to. They understood consequence. They understood that the earth can change faster than tradition, and that awareness alone might be worth preserving. The repeated burial and rebuilding seen in later ancient sites may reflect this lesson. When destruction comes, rebuild. When rebuilding, remember. And when memory grows distant, encode it again in stone. This cycle of loss and reconstruction becomes one of humanity's defining behaviors. Cities rise. Cities fall. Each time, survivors search the ruins not only for materials, but for meaning. What went wrong? What must not be repeated? In this sense, myth is not backward-looking. It is forward-facing. It warns descendants not to assume permanence. It teaches vigilance without providing precise predictions, because precision would expire. Pattern endures. The builders of the deep past may have accepted that they could not stop the cycle, only prepare minds to recognize it, only ensure that when the world shifts again, someone will say, "This has happened before." And perhaps that is why the most ancient sanctuaries feel less like celebrations and more like observatories. They watch, they mark, they remember. They do not promise safety, they promise awareness. As humanity moved further from the Ice Age, the urgency of this awareness would fade. Comfort would return. Stability would breed confidence. And confidence would eventually harden into the belief that the cycle had ended. History shows what happens next. When confidence replaces vigilance, memory becomes ornamental. The warnings survive, but they are admired rather than heeded. Monuments become heritage. Myths become literature. The sense of living inside a fragile system dissolves. This transition is subtle. It does not feel like forgetting. It feels like progress. Crops become reliable. Trade networks expand. Writing fixes stories in place. What was once flexible adapts less. Knowledge gains permanence but loses context. Written records freeze myth into canon. Flood stories become sacred history rather than adaptive warning. Astronomical observations become calendar rituals rather than existential monitoring. The sky is still watched, but more for scheduling than survival. This shift allows civilizations to flourish. It also blinds them. As societies grow confident in their mastery of environment, they build larger, heavier, more centralized systems. Irrigation networks, bureaucracies, armies. These systems amplify human power, but they also amplify vulnerability. When they fail catastrophically. The ancient world experienced this repeatedly. Civilizations rose in stable climatic windows and collapsed when conditions shifted. Droughts, floods, cold snaps. The pattern repeats so often that it becomes almost rhythmic. Each collapse produces survivors who tell stories of lost golden ages. Each time, the past is idealized, and the original lesson blurs. The cycle continues. Seen from this perspective, Göbekli Tepe occupies a unique psychological position. It stands before confidence, before writing, before empire. It reflects a humanity that had been humbled early, that built not from abundance, but from caution. Its silence is instructive. There is no triumph carved into its stones, no record of victory, only presence, only continuity, only a quiet insistence that the relationship between human beings and the world is conditional. As we move forward through history, the sacred will continue to evolve. It will wear crowns, it will command armies, it will justify conquest. But somewhere beneath those layers, the older awareness remains, resurfacing whenever disaster strips power away. This is why, in every age of collapse, people rediscover ancient sites with new eyes. Ruins speak more clearly after systems fail. They remind survivors that collapse is not abnormal. It is part of the pattern. Göbekli Tepe speaks from a time when that truth was still fresh, when the wound had not yet scarred over, when memory had not yet been softened by comfort. To listen to it now is to stand briefly in that same threshold, between fear and understanding, between fragility and resilience, between the world that was lost and the one that learned, slowly, how to continue. And as we follow this thread further, it leads us toward an unsettling reflection, that the ancient builders may not have been warning only their immediate descendants. They may have been warning anyone who would eventually feel too secure inside a system they did not fully understand. To hear that warning clearly, we must now turn our attention outward again, toward the sky, where ancient observers believed the deepest patterns of renewal and destruction were written slowly and without emotion across the ages. When ancient observers turned their attention to the sky, they were not seeking transcendence. They were seeking context. The heavens offered something the earth could not: regularity. Seasons might fail, rivers might change, but the stars moved with patience, returning again and again, indifferent to human fear. This regularity made the sky feel like a code, a slow script written in light, readable only by those willing to watch long enough. Over generations, patterns emerged. Certain stars rose when floods came. Others marked planting times. Some disappeared for months, only to return in predictable cycles. Memory attached itself to these movements. In time, the sky became a second landscape, one more stable than the ground beneath human feet. To understand it was to gain a measure of psychological safety. Even if catastrophe struck, the stars would still be there. Order existed somewhere, even if Earth betrayed it. This belief reshaped cosmology. The heavens were no longer distant. They were authoritative. If disaster came from above or coincided with celestial change, then the sky must be watched with humility, not worshipped blindly, but studied. Many ancient cultures encoded this relationship in the idea of cycles, ages of the world, great years, periods of creation followed by destruction and renewal. These were not abstract philosophies. They were frameworks for coping with instability. The idea that the world resets periodically can be terrifying, but it can also be grounding. It suggests that collapse is not failure. It is transition. And if transition is inevitable, then the task of humanity is not to prevent it, but to endure it consciously. Stone architecture aligned to the sky becomes a way to synchronize with this idea. Each alignment says, we know where we are in the cycle. Each monument says, we were paying attention. Each sanctuary says, memory outlives disaster. Göbekli Tepe may represent one of the earliest physical expressions of this worldview. Not a theory written down, but a conviction acted upon. The belief that if humans could fix their understanding of time and pattern into the landscape, they might remain oriented even as conditions shifted. This orientation is subtle. It does not promise control. It promises awareness. a way to avoid being completely surprised by change, even if one cannot stop it. And so, the sky becomes a teacher rather than a ruler. Its movements are lessons. Its cycles are reminders. It does not punish. It repeats. This perspective differs sharply from later interpretations, where gods intervene directly, rewarding and destroying according to moral codes. That shift may reflect growing social complexity rather than growing understanding. When societies become hierarchical, the cosmos often follows. The earliest skywatchers seem less concerned with judgment and more concerned with timing. When to gather, when to move, when to build, when to prepare. And timing, above all, is the one gift the sky offers consistently. To read it is to live with a sense of proportion. To misread it is to drift. As we move deeper into this ancient cosmology, we begin to sense that the builders of the deep past were not obsessed with the end of the world. They were obsessed with recognizing when one world ends and another begins. Recognizing the end of one world does not require prophecy. It requires sensitivity, the ability to notice when familiar patterns weaken, when thresholds approach. Ancient societies trained this sensitivity not only through observation, but through ritual repetition. Ritual slows perception. It creates pause. In that pause, change becomes visible. Without pause, change feels sudden and inexplicable. This may be why the earliest sanctuaries emphasize enclosure and repetition. They are designed to pull attention inward and outward simultaneously. At Göbekli Tepe, the circular form itself reinforces this mindset. Circles have no beginning and no end. They do not point forward aggressively. They return. To gather inside a circle is to accept recurrence as fundamental. This contrasts with later linear thinking, where history is imagined as progress toward a goal. Linear thinking encourages accumulation. Cyclical thinking encourages balance. Both are useful, but imbalance between them carries risk. Early humanity, fresh from climatic upheaval, may have leaned naturally toward cycles. Their lives depended on it. Linear ambition would have felt naive in a world that had already proven its volatility. As agriculture stabilized life, linear thinking grew stronger. Growth became possible. Surplus encouraged expansion. With expansion came the belief that the future could be engineered. But the older cyclical awareness never fully disappeared. It went underground. It resurfaced in times of crisis. It spoke through myth and symbol when rational planning failed. This duality persists throughout human history. The desire to control the future, and the intuition that the future ultimately resists control. Ancient monuments exist at the tension point between these impulses. They are acts of intention, yet they acknowledge forces beyond intention. They are human assertions built in dialogue with non-human rhythms. Göbekli Tepe's builders may have stood closer to this balance than later societies. Their work feels neither defensive nor triumphant. It feels preparatory. Preparation implies expectation, not of a specific event, but of change itself. The acceptance that stability is temporary. This acceptance shapes ethics as well as architecture. Societies that expect change value adaptability. They emphasize memory over accumulation. They teach children stories rather than inventories. As memory spreads and transforms, its original context dims, but its emotional core remains. The fear of forgetting. The fear of repeating mistakes without understanding why. If we follow this emotional thread forward, we begin to see how ancient cosmology gradually turns inward, becoming philosophy. The cycles of the sky become metaphors for cycles of the soul. Death and rebirth shift from environmental realities to personal transformations. Yet the origin remains external. The inner cycle mirrors the outer one. Consciousness imitates cosmos. And this mirroring may be the deepest legacy of the earliest builders. They did not separate human experience from planetary experience. They saw them as reflections of one another. In doing so, they planted a worldview that would resurface again and again, even after empires rose and fell. A worldview that insists the human story cannot be understood in isolation from the earth and sky that contain it. As civilizations layered meaning onto the sky, they began to divide it. Constellations were named, paths were mapped, the heavens became organized into narratives that could be taught and inherited. What was once fluid observation hardened into structure. This structuring served memory, but it also constrained it. When patterns are fixed too rigidly, they resist revision. Yet the sky itself continues to change, slowly but relentlessly. Stars drift, poles shift, alignments alter over centuries. Early observers likely noticed this drift without fully quantifying it. They may have sensed that the sky of their ancestors was not identical to their own. This awareness could reinforce the idea of long cycles, far longer than a human life. Later cultures, inheriting fragments of this awareness without direct experience of upheaval, sometimes mythologized the drift itself. Ages ruled by different gods, worlds governed by different suns, the sense that cosmic order itself evolves. These ideas may feel abstract now, but they were grounded in observation. To watch the sky faithfully over generations is to witness slow transformation. It teaches patience, but it also teaches impermanence. Göbekli Tepe's builders, standing near the edge of a climatic turning point, may have felt this lesson acutely. The world they inherited was not the world they passed on. That realization alone can shape an entire philosophy. If the world changes, then meaning must be resilient rather than precise. It must survive reinterpretation. This may be why the earliest symbols are ambiguous. Animals rather than written commands. Forms rather than formulas. Ambiguity is not weakness. It is adaptability. It allows memory to adjust to new contexts without breaking. As memory traveled forward in time, this adaptability would be tested. Empires prefer certainty. Dogma simplifies governance. Ambiguity becomes dangerous. And yet, whenever dogma collapses under its own rigidity, humanity returns to symbols, returns to stories that can breathe, returns to older forms of meaning that resist absolute interpretation. This oscillation between structure and fluidity mirrors the very cycles ancient observers saw in the sky: expansion and contraction, fixation and release. Seen this way, Göbekli Tepe does not belong to the beginning of civilization. It belongs to the beginning of reflection, the moment humans began to see themselves as actors within patterns they did not create. That awareness does not disappear. It goes quiet. It waits. And when it returns, it often does so in moments of uncertainty, when the future feels unstable again, when the old assurances no longer hold, which brings us closer to our own time than it might first appear. In periods of relative stability, ancient warnings feel remote. The past becomes decorative. Ruins are admired, not consulted. But when uncertainty grows, memory regains its urgency. Throughout history, moments of environmental stress, social fragmentation, or technological disruption have sparked renewed interest in ancient knowledge. People look backward not out of nostalgia, but out of instinct. They sense that earlier minds may have navigated similar thresholds. This instinct does not always seek factual answers. It seeks orientation. How did others remain human when the ground beneath them shifted? How did they preserve meaning when systems failed? Göbekli Tepe speaks most clearly in such moments, not because it offers solutions, but because it models a response. It shows that when the future becomes unreliable, memory becomes essential. Its builders did not attempt to predict exact outcomes. They prepared consciousness. They created a place where attention could be trained, where stories could be anchored, where the relationship between humanity and the greater cycles could be rehearsed. That is a different kind of resilience than stockpiles or walls. It is psychological resilience, cultural resilience. As modern observers, we are tempted to project our own anxieties backward, to see ancient monuments as warnings aimed directly at us. This is understandable but incomplete. The builders were not prophets in the modern sense. They were witnesses. They responded to what they had seen, not to what they imagined. And what they had seen was enough to convince them that the world can change faster than assumptions. In that sense, their message remains relevant without being specific. It does not tell us what will happen. It reminds us that something will happen, that cycles do not pause for belief. Whether through climate, geology, or forces not yet understood, change is guaranteed. The question is not whether humanity will face disruption again. It is whether we will face it consciously. Göbekli Tepe does not demand reverence. It invites humility. It suggests that awareness is the most durable architecture humans can build. As we continue this journey deeper into ancient memory, we will see how this awareness fragments, reassembles, and resurfaces across continents and eras. How the same impulse appears in different forms, carrying the same quiet insistence. That insistence says only this: remember that the world you stand on has changed before. Remember that intelligence alone is not enough. Remember that meaning, when anchored carefully, can survive even the most profound transformation. And from that remembrance, new worlds can begin. From that remembrance, new worlds do begin, but never as cleanly as stories suggest. They begin unevenly, with fragments of the old embedded inside the new. Memory does not reset. It layers. As humans spread farther from the original landscapes of upheaval, the intensity of the lesson softened. The urgency of vigilance gave way to the confidence of adaptation. Tools improved, crops stabilized, trade connected distant regions. The earth seemed once again predictable enough to trust. And yet, in the margins of these growing societies, traces of the older awareness persisted. They lived in festivals tied to solstices, in taboos about overuse of land, in stories told to children about times when the world had to be rebuilt. These traces often survived longest among those closest to nature: pastoralists, fisher communities, mountain peoples, groups whose lives still depended on reading subtle environmental signs. For them, cycles were not abstract. They were daily reality. In contrast, urban centers increasingly buffered themselves from nature's fluctuations. Storage reduced hunger, walls reduced fear, writing reduced reliance on oral memory. Each buffer made life more stable but also more detached. Detachment breeds a particular illusion: that humans stand apart from the systems that sustain them, that progress replaces vulnerability, that the past is something safely concluded. Ancient sanctuaries quietly contradict this illusion. They do not celebrate separation. They emphasize connection, alignment, participation. Göbekli Tepe, in its restraint, seems to insist that humanity is never outside the cycle. No matter how clever the tools, no matter how dense the cities, the deeper rhythms continue. This insistence may be why such sites were eventually abandoned or repurposed, not because they lost meaning, but because their meaning conflicted with emerging worldviews. A civilization built on expansion does not easily accommodate reminders of limits. Still, limits reassert themselves, always. When droughts came, rituals intensified. When floods destroyed fields, myths resurfaced. When empires collapsed, survivors returned to older narratives of renewal. The cycle replayed again and again at different scales. Each replay reshaped memory further. What began as observation became cosmology. What became cosmology became theology. What became theology became philosophy. and philosophy, when challenged by reality, returned to observation. This circular movement mirrors the very worldview early builders may have held intuitively. That knowledge itself moves in cycles. That forgetting is not failure, but part of the process. That remembering always returns, even if it takes centuries. Seen through this lens, history is not a march forward. It is a tide. It advances, retreats, reshapes the shore, and leaves behind markers of where it once reached. Göbekli Tepe is one such marker, not the first, not the last, but among the clearest. As the tide of history continues its slow movement, another transformation occurs. Memory becomes internalized. The external monuments remain, but their function shifts. The focus moves from aligning stone with sky to aligning thought with meaning. This is where ancient cosmology turns inward decisively. The cycles of nature become metaphors for the cycles of consciousness. Death and rebirth are no longer only events in the world. They become experiences of the self. Philosophical traditions emerge that speak of inner order mirroring outer order, harmony within reflecting harmony without. These ideas feel abstract, but they are rooted in the same impulse that raised the earliest sanctuaries, to understand one's place in a larger pattern. In some cultures, this inward turn preserves humility. In others, it drifts toward control. Knowledge of cycles becomes knowledge of fate. Fate becomes hierarchy. Hierarchy becomes justification. Yet even distorted forms carry echoes of the original insight, the belief that imbalance leads to collapse, that excess invites correction, that cycles cannot be escaped, only navigated. Throughout antiquity, thinkers return to these ideas independently. They speak of ages of the world, of rises and falls governed by principles rather than chance, of wisdom lost and regained. What they often lack is direct memory of the original events that inspired such thinking. Their philosophies are reflections of reflections. Still, the core remains intact enough to resonate. Modern minds sometimes dismiss this resonance as coincidence. But coincidence does not explain persistence. It does not explain why, across cultures separated by oceans, similar intuitions about cycles and renewal emerge again and again. Persistence suggests inheritance, not genetic, but cognitive, a pattern of thought shaped by early experience and reinforced by repeated encounters with instability. Göbekli Tepe belongs to that inheritance. It is not a message with instructions. It is a posture, a way of standing in the world, alert, humble, attentive. That posture is easy to abandon in times of comfort. It is difficult to recover in times of crisis, which is why ancient builders invested so much effort in making it durable. Stone does not argue. It does not persuade. It waits. It waits because time, for stone, is not urgent. While human generations rise and vanish, the stone remains, absorbing weather, silence, and neglect with equal patience. This patience may be the most profound lesson ancient monuments offer. The builders of the deep past did not expect to be remembered by name. They expected the work to outlast them. That expectation reveals a different relationship with legacy than the one familiar today. Legacy was not about recognition. It was about continuity, ensuring that something essential would survive, even if its origin was forgotten. In this sense, forgetting was anticipated. The builders likely knew that future generations would reinterpret their work, misunderstand it, argue about it. That did not negate the effort. It was part of the design. Ambiguity protects meaning. A clear instruction expires. A symbol adapts. Göbekli Tepe's silence is not emptiness. It is space left intentionally open. Space for future minds to enter with their own questions. And perhaps that is why the site feels so strangely contemporary. Not because it answers modern anxieties, but because it mirrors them. We, too, live in a time of shifting systems, of environmental uncertainty, of rapid change that outpaces tradition. The difference is scale. The builders faced a world reshaped by ice and water. We face one reshaped by our own momentum. Yet the psychological challenge is similar: how to remain oriented when familiar structures feel unstable. The ancient response was to slow down and watch, to anchor meaning in cycles rather than outcomes, to build places that trained attention rather than demanded belief. Those places still exist, buried, weathered, incomplete. They do not speak loudly. They wait for those willing to listen without urgency. As we continue deeper into this exploration, the focus shifts once more, from what ancient builders may have known to what their way of knowing can teach us now, not as instruction, but as reminder. Because the most enduring architecture is not built in stone. It is built in awareness. Awareness, once awakened, does not remain fixed. It drifts, just as the sky drifts, just as coastlines do. What changes is not the truth itself, but the way it is held. Ancient builders understood this intuitively. They did not attempt to freeze meaning. They created conditions for meaning to re-emerge. This is why so many early sanctuaries feel unfinished, open to reinterpretation. They are not conclusions, they are thresholds, places designed to slow the mind enough for insight to arise naturally. In later eras, humanity often demanded certainty from the sacred: clear laws, defined doctrines, promises of permanence. These demands reflect anxiety rather than confidence. They arise when people fear that ambiguity will dissolve order. But ambiguity is where adaptation lives. The builders of the deep past seem to have trusted it. Their monuments do not explain themselves. They invite presence. They assume that understanding is experiential, not instructional. This approach requires patience. It assumes that each generation will rediscover meaning for itself, rather than inherit it fully formed. That rediscovery may be imperfect, but it is alive. Göbekli Tepe exemplifies this philosophy through absence as much as presence. There are no inscriptions telling us what to think, no declarations of truth, only form, orientation, and symbol. The rest is left to the participant. Such restraint is rare in later monumental traditions. As power consolidates, monuments speak louder. They proclaim authority. They reduce interpretation. The sacred becomes centralized. Yet centralized meaning is brittle. When it breaks, it shatters rather than bends. Decentralized meaning, encoded in symbol and experience, fractures, but survives. This may explain why fragments of ancient cosmology persist even after empires fall. The symbols resurface in new contexts. The cycles are rediscovered. The warnings reappear in altered form. Human consciousness seems to oscillate between forgetting and remembering, control and humility. The deep past offers a model for navigating this oscillation without collapsing into despair or dominance. The builders were not trying to escape nature. They were trying to remain in relationship with it. A relationship requires listening. It requires restraint. It requires accepting that some forces cannot be commanded. As we move forward in time, toward eras of increased complexity and abstraction, this relationship becomes strained. Humans gain unprecedented power, yet struggle to maintain proportion. The ancient stones watch this unfolding silently. They do not intervene. They simply remain, reminders that other ways of knowing have existed and may exist again. Across millennia, this silent watching becomes part of the landscape of the human psyche. Even when monuments are forgotten, their presence shapes how people feel about certain places. Hills feel sacred. Springs feel alive. Horizons feel meaningful. This intuitive geography predates maps and borders. It arises from long familiarity with land as teacher rather than resource. Early societies listened to place. They noticed where stories gathered naturally, where sound carried differently, where light behaved strangely at certain times of year. Göbekli Tepe occupies such a place, not because it is dramatic, but because it is subtle. A rise rather than a peak, a vantage point that does not dominate but observes. The choice of location reveals sensitivity rather than ambition. Later civilizations often sought extremes, highest peaks, deepest valleys, monumental visibility. The sacred became theatrical. But early sanctuaries feel intimate. They are built for participation, not spectacle. This intimacy matters. It suggests that the earliest builders were not seeking to impress the sky. They were seeking to listen to it. Listening requires humility. It assumes the world has something to say independent of human desire. This assumption is not universal. It must be cultivated. Ancient ritual was one method of cultivation. By repeating gestures, by aligning movement with cycles, people trained themselves to notice subtle change. Ritual was not superstition. It was discipline. Discipline of attention. Discipline of memory. Discipline of proportion. Over time, as societies grew larger and more complex, this discipline became harder to maintain. Attention fragmented. Memory specialized. Proportion gave way to ambition. Yet whenever ambition outpaced understanding, collapse followed. And in the aftermath, survivors often returned to older ways of seeing, simpler rituals, seasonal awareness, respect for limits. This pattern repeats so reliably that it begins to feel structural, as if human consciousness itself must periodically recalibrate by shedding excess. Göbekli Tepe may represent one of the earliest recalibrations, a moment when humanity, faced with planetary change, paused long enough to redefine its relationship with the world. That pause echoes still, not as a command, but as a possibility. Possibility is a fragile thing. It requires openness, but openness invites uncertainty. Ancient builders accepted this trade. They chose awareness over assurance. Modern minds often struggle with this choice. We seek guarantees, predictions, control. Yet the world resists these desires just as it always has. The ancient worldview does not promise safety. It offers orientation. Knowing where you are in a cycle does not stop the cycle. It helps you respond without panic. This distinction is subtle but profound. Panic narrows perception. Orientation widens it. Panic demands immediate solutions. Orientation allows timing. The earliest sanctuaries seem designed to cultivate orientation. Their geometry slows movement. Their symbols provoke contemplation rather than reaction. Their alignment with the sky situates human time within cosmic time. Standing inside such a space, one is reminded that urgency is often a matter of perspective, that the present moment is nested inside larger rhythms. This awareness does not eliminate danger, it contextualizes it. And context can be the difference between collapse and adaptation. As we consider how ancient memory persists into later eras, we begin to see that its greatest influence may not be technological or architectural, but psychological. The builders left behind a way of paying attention, a posture toward reality that balances reverence with realism, acceptance with curiosity. That posture is difficult to sustain. It requires resisting extremes, neither denying change nor surrendering to it, neither dominating nature nor romanticizing it. History shows how rarely humanity maintains this balance for long, but it also shows how consistently we return to it after disruption. Göbekli Tepe stands as one of the earliest physical expressions of that balance. It does not solve the problem of impermanence. It acknowledges it. And acknowledgement, when sincere, can be transformative. Transformation does not announce itself loudly. It begins as a shift in perception, a quiet reorientation. Ancient builders seem to understand this. Their work does not shock, it settles. Even now, encountering such a site produces a different kind of response than encountering later monuments. There is less awe, more curiosity, less reverence, more intimacy. This emotional tone matters. Awe can distance. Intimacy invites reflection. Göbekli Tepe does not ask to be worshipped. It asks to be considered. Its silence draws the mind inward, toward questions rather than answers. Why build this way? Why here? Why then? These questions resist closure. They remain open, circulating through generations, inviting reinterpretation. In this way, the site continues to function as intended, not as a static relic, but as an active catalyst. The builders may not have anticipated archaeology, but they anticipated rediscovery. They knew that meaning buried carefully could survive long dormancy. Their confidence was not in knowledge, but in continuity, in the human capacity to ask again. As we move closer to the later phases of this long narrative, we begin to sense how this ancient posture toward the world will be tested, reshaped, and sometimes lost, as humanity enters periods of unprecedented complexity. Yet even in those moments, the quiet lesson endures. Waiting, watching, remembering, because the world has ended before, and it has continued, and so have we. Because the world has ended before, humanity learned to live with an unspoken awareness. Continuity is not guaranteed, but it is possible. This awareness shapes cultures long after its origin fades from conscious memory. As societies grow more intricate, they often reinterpret ancient caution as myth rather than method. The stories remain, but their function changes. What was once a guide for perception becomes a narrative for identity. We tell stories not to orient ourselves within cycles, but to explain who we are. This shift subtly alters behavior. Identity seeks preservation. Orientation seeks balance. When identity dominates, civilizations cling to form even as conditions change. When orientation dominates, civilizations adapt, sometimes at the cost of tradition. Ancient builders appear to have favored orientation. Their sanctuaries are adaptable by nature. They do not prescribe belief, they cultivate awareness. Later systems, especially those tied to power, invert this relationship. Awareness becomes secondary to continuity of structure. Institutions harden. Ritual becomes obligation. Meaning becomes law. Yet laws cannot negotiate with climate, geology, or time. When conditions shift beyond tolerance, structures collapse regardless of belief. History records this again and again. The fall is often attributed to enemies, decadence, or fate. Rarely is it attributed to misalignment with reality itself. That truth is harder to accept. The deep past may have offered a different lesson. That survival depends less on strength than on responsiveness, less on dominance than on listening. Göbekli Tepe does not glorify conquest. It does not celebrate expansion. It honors presence. It marks attention. Perhaps that is why it was eventually buried. A worldview centered on restraint does not serve societies bent on growth. The message becomes inconvenient. But inconvenience does not erase truth. It only delays its return. When disruption arrives, the old awareness resurfaces. People ask different questions, not how to win, but how to endure, not how to control, but how to remain coherent. In these moments, ancient sites regain relevance. They are not consulted as blueprints, but as reminders that other responses have existed. Endurance, in the ancient sense, was not passive. It was active alignment. To endure was to move with change rather than resist it blindly. This is why early sanctuaries emphasize cycles over permanence. Stone lasts, but it does not claim immortality. It accepts erosion. It ages with dignity. Later monuments often attempt to deny time. They are built to impress future generations, to assert dominance across centuries. Their failure is often dramatic. Göbekli Tepe's success is quiet. It does not dominate the horizon. It hides. It waits. This waiting reflects confidence in time rather than fear of it. A belief that what matters will eventually be rediscovered, even if forgotten for long intervals. Such confidence is rare. It requires trust in human curiosity rather than control over human behavior. The builders trusted that future minds would ask questions, that someone, somewhere, would wonder why stones were arranged this way, why animals were carved with such care, why the site was buried. They trusted curiosity as a force stronger than ignorance. This trust is a form of optimism, but not a naive one. It does not assume progress. It assumes return. Return to questions. Return to awareness. Return to humility. This cyclical optimism differs from linear hope. It does not expect constant improvement. It expects fluctuation with opportunities for recalibration. Seen through this lens, ancient memory becomes less about preserving facts and more about preserving posture. How to stand in a changing world. How to look at the sky without demanding answers. How to build without pretending permanence. These lessons are subtle. They resist slogans. They must be lived rather than declared. Lived lessons are fragile. They require continuity of practice. When practice breaks, the lesson survives only as abstraction. This may explain why ancient wisdom often feels elusive. We inherit the words, but not the habits. We read about cycles, but we do not live cyclically. We admire balance, but we structure our lives linearly. The builders of the deep past lived within limits that enforced awareness. Hunger, weather, darkness. These conditions demanded attention. Modern societies buffer these demands. Artificial light erases night. Storage erases seasonality. Technology erases distance. These achievements are real, but they alter perception. When perception shifts, ancient lessons feel less intuitive. They become philosophical rather than practical. Yet when buffers fail, perception shifts back abruptly. Blackouts, crop failures, supply disruptions. Suddenly, cycles are no longer abstract. In these moments, ancient memory feels less distant. It feels familiar, even if unrecognized. Göbekli Tepe does not offer solutions to modern problems. It offers context. It reminds us that our experience of uncertainty is not new, that others have faced worlds that felt equally unstable. They responded not with domination, but with observation, not with denial, but with preparation. Preparation of the mind, preparation of memory. This kind of preparation does not expire. It remains relevant whenever certainty fades. As we approach the later stages of this long arc, the narrative turns inward once more, not toward mysticism, but toward responsibility. Ancient builders understood that knowledge carries weight. To know cycles is to know limits. To know limits is to accept responsibility for action. Later cultures often separated knowledge from consequence. Information became power. Power became entitlement. The deep past suggests a different relationship. Knowledge as obligation, awareness as restraint. Göbekli Tepe embodies this ethic through absence. There is no instruction to conquer, no command to expand, only a framework for remembering what happens when balance breaks. This memory does not judge, it does not moralize, it observes. In that sense, the ancient worldview aligns more closely with ecological thinking than with theology. It recognizes systems, thresholds, feedback. Modern science is rediscovering these principles through data rather than myth. Climate systems, tipping points, non-linear change. The language is different. The insight is familiar. Perhaps this is why ancient sites resonate today, not because they predict catastrophe, but because they model awareness of complexity. They remind us that simple narratives fail in complex systems, that control has limits, that adaptation requires humility. Humility is not weakness, it is clarity, the clarity to see oneself as part of a system rather than above it. Ancient builders may not have articulated this philosophically, but they lived it architecturally. Their structures integrate with landscape rather than dominate it. Their symbols integrate humans with animals rather than elevate them above. This integration reflects a worldview in which survival depends on cooperation with forces beyond control. As we stand now, inheritors of both ancient memory and modern power, this worldview challenges us gently but persistently, not to abandon progress, not to romanticize the past, but to recover proportion. Göbekli Tepe offers no answers to contemporary questions. It offers a mirror, a reminder that the human story has always unfolded between confidence and humility, between forgetting and remembering. The stones do not accuse, they wait. And waiting, in this context, is not passivity. It is patience born of long experience, because the world will change again, and when it does, what endures will not be certainty, but awareness. And awareness, once cultivated, can survive even the end of worlds. Awareness that survives the end of worlds carries a different weight than knowledge accumulated in calm eras. It is quieter, less certain, more careful. It does not announce itself as truth. It recognizes itself as memory. By the time humanity enters fully into recorded history, this kind of awareness has become rare, but not extinct. It survives in margins, in myths dismissed as allegory, in rituals repeated without full understanding. It waits in the background of civilization, ready to surface when confidence cracks. The ancient builders may have anticipated this disappearance. They may have understood that awareness cannot be institutionalized without being altered, that once it becomes doctrine, it loses flexibility. And flexibility is what allows memory to endure disruption. Göbekli Tepe's silence feels intentional in this light. It does not explain itself because explanation would anchor it to one era's language. Instead, it allows each generation to encounter it fresh, guided by their own questions and fears. This openness is unsettling to modern minds trained to demand conclusions. We want to know what it means. The builders seem to ask instead whether we are ready to mean something by it. Meaning, in the ancient sense, was not something assigned, it was something practiced. You did not ask what the cycle meant, you lived in awareness of it. You aligned behavior accordingly. As humanity moved toward abstraction, this lived alignment weakened. We learned to describe systems without participating in them consciously. We learned to predict without restraint. We learned to model without reverence. Yet the ancient awareness never vanished completely. It resurfaced whenever models failed, whenever prediction collapsed, whenever the future refused to behave as expected. In those moments, people reached for older frameworks, not because they were nostalgic, but because they were resilient. They did not promise control. They promised orientation. Orientation is subtle. It does not remove danger. It reduces disorientation. It allows response instead of panic. This is the quiet gift ancient builders may have left behind, not instructions for survival, but a way of facing uncertainty without denial or despair. As we move toward the final stages of this long reflection, the question becomes personal rather than historical. Not what they knew, but how they stood in the world. Not what they built, but why they built it that way. Because the past does not ask to be replicated. It asks to be understood. And understanding, like awareness, begins in silence. Silence is where understanding gathers itself, not the absence of sound, but the absence of urgency. Ancient builders cultivated this silence deliberately. They created spaces where the world slowed, where attention could deepen, where thought did not rush ahead of perception. In such spaces, humans remember that they are not separate from time. They are inside it, moving with it, subject to its rhythms. Göbekli Tepe feels like one of these spaces because it resists narrative closure. It does not guide the visitor toward a single conclusion. It offers presence instead. Stone, light, shadow, and the long arc of the sky above. This resistance may be its most radical quality. In a world increasingly shaped by explanation, it insists on experience. It trusts that experience will shape understanding more durably than instruction. Ancient societies understood this trust intuitively. Knowledge transmitted through lived ritual endures longer than knowledge transmitted through authority alone. Ritual embeds memory in the body. Authority embeds it in structure. Structures fall. Bodies adapt. The builders of the deep past may not have articulated this distinction, but they acted on it. Their sanctuaries invite movement, gathering, repetition. They do not isolate the sacred from the human. They integrate it. Later traditions often elevate the sacred beyond reach, placing it behind walls, atop platforms, or within hierarchies. Access becomes controlled. Meaning becomes mediated. This mediation stabilizes large societies, but it weakens individual orientation. People learn what to believe, but not how to pay attention. The deep past offers a counterexample, a time when attention itself was sacred, when watching the sky was not delegated, but communal. That communal watching fostered humility. No single person owned the pattern. Everyone depended on it. This dependence shaped ethics as much as cosmology. To ignore the pattern was not rebellion. It was risk. Risk sharpens perception. It teaches discernment without abstraction. The ancient builders lived with risk close at hand. Weather could turn. Animals could vanish. Land could flood. In such conditions, attention becomes survival. You learn to notice small changes, to listen before acting, to wait when waiting matters. Modern life often removes this immediacy. Risk becomes distant, managed, deferred. Attention scatters, perception dulls, yet the human nervous system has not changed. It still responds to uncertainty by seeking patterns. When immediate feedback disappears, anxiety grows. Ancient sanctuaries may have functioned as regulators of this anxiety. By reintroducing rhythm and proportion, they restored coherence to perception. Standing within a circular enclosure, watching shadows move predictably, hearing stories repeated across seasons, the mind settles. It remembers that not everything changes at once. This settling is not passive. It allows discernment. It creates space for choice. The builders may have valued this internal stability more than any external structure. Stone was simply the most reliable medium available to support it. As societies moved away from direct environmental feedback, this internal stability became harder to cultivate. Ritual lost immediacy. Symbols lost context. Still, the need did not disappear. It waited. Whenever instability returned, people rediscovered practices that slowed time: fasting, pilgrimage, silence, night vigils, watching the sky. These practices echo the deep past. They are not inventions of theology. They are responses to uncertainty. Göbekli Tepe stands at the root of this lineage, not as a doctrine, but as a practice encoded in place. Place matters because it anchors memory beyond language. A story can change with telling. A place resists alteration. It holds atmosphere. It shapes behavior. The builders of early sanctuaries chose their places carefully, not for defense, not for dominance, for relationship. The hill of Göbekli Tepe does not command the region. It observes it. From there, the horizon is wide. The sky is open. The land speaks quietly. This choice reveals a sensitivity to context that modern planning often lacks. It suggests that the builders understood place as participant rather than backdrop. In later eras, architecture often seeks to impose meaning on place. Early sanctuaries listen first. This listening is evident in orientation. Structures respond to light. They frame sunrise. They acknowledge cardinal directions. They align with cycles rather than resisting them. Such alignment is not superstition. It is dialogue. To build in dialogue with the world is to accept limitation. You cannot place anything anywhere. You must negotiate with terrain, with sky, with season. This negotiation teaches restraint. It fosters respect. As human power grew, this negotiation was often replaced by assertion. Landscapes were reshaped rather than consulted. Rivers were redirected. Mountains were cut. These actions increased control but decreased awareness. The consequences unfolded slowly, then suddenly. Ancient builders, lacking such power, cultivated awareness instead. Their legacy reflects this choice. Choice is the quiet current running beneath every ancient structure, even when no choice seems visible on the surface. In the deep past, humans did not choose comfort. They did not choose certainty. They chose orientation, and that choice shaped everything that followed. Early humanity lived inside limits that could not be negotiated. Seasons dictated movement. Climate dictated survival. The land itself set the terms. Within those boundaries, choice did not mean freedom from constraint, but response to it. How to act when the world shifts. How to remain coherent when stability dissolves. Göbekli Tepe reflects this mindset with remarkable clarity. Nothing there suggests conquest or permanence. Nothing claims ownership of the land or mastery over time. Instead, the site feels like an act of acknowledgement, a recognition that the world had changed and that humans needed to change how they understood their place within it. This is a subtle form of intelligence, often overlooked. It does not produce immediate results. It does not generate power or expansion. It produces continuity of awareness. And awareness, unlike control, can move across generations. As millennia passed, this choice became harder to recognize. Later civilizations inherited the structures without the urgency that created them. The memory of instability softened. Prosperity encouraged confidence. Confidence encouraged ambition. Yet beneath every ambitious system, the original choice remained unresolved. Whether to live as participants in a living world or as managers attempting to outpace it. The deep past chose participation, not submission, but relationship, a willingness to listen as much as to act. That choice did not prevent collapse. Nothing can. But it shaped how collapse was understood, not as punishment, not as failure, but as transition within a larger rhythm. This is what makes the ancient posture so difficult for modern minds to grasp. We are trained to see endings as errors. The deep past saw them as thresholds. Thresholds are uncomfortable places. They are neither here nor there. They strip away certainty and expose assumption. Ancient builders seemed drawn to such spaces, both physically and psychologically. Circular enclosures, open horizons, liminal landscapes between plains and hills, these are not places of settlement. They are places of pause, places where one stands between states, aware that movement in either direction carries consequence. Göbekli Tepe occupies this kind of space, not a village, not a fortress, not a city. It exists outside everyday life, yet remains connected to it. This separation suggests intention, a desire to create distance without isolation. In threshold spaces, attention sharpens. One listens more carefully. One speaks less. One becomes aware of patterns that daily routine obscures. The builders may have understood that awareness cannot be maintained continuously. It requires interruption, ritualized pause, withdrawal from productivity and accumulation. Later societies struggled with this truth. As population density increased and social systems grew complex, uninterrupted production became necessary. Pause became inefficiency. Silence became emptiness. Yet without pause, orientation erodes. Systems continue until they exceed tolerance. Collapse arrives not because it was unpredictable, but because attention was exhausted. The deep past offers an alternative rhythm, periods of engagement balanced by periods of reflection, movement balanced by stillness. Göbekli Tepe may have functioned as a collective threshold, a place where communities stepped out of survival mode and into awareness mode, where stories were retold, alignments observed, and memory recalibrated. Such spaces are rare today, but the need they addressed has not vanished. When coherence breaks, fear fills the vacuum. Fear simplifies. It demands certainty where none exists. It seeks authority, rigid explanation, absolute answers. Ancient builders appear to have recognized this tendency and designed against it. Their sanctuaries do not offer certainty. They offer stability of attention. Stability of attention does not remove fear, but it prevents fear from dominating perception. It allows complexity to be held without collapse. Göbekli Tepe achieves this through repetition and proportion. The eye moves slowly. The body adjusts to rhythm. The mind settles into observation rather than reaction. This is not mysticism. It is neurological reality. Human perception stabilizes when exposed to predictable pattern. Pattern restores coherence. The builders likely did not know this in scientific terms, but they knew it experientially. They built environments that shaped consciousness gently, without coercion. As history progressed, this subtle shaping was replaced by louder forms of meaning, doctrine, monumentality, power symbols. These capture attention quickly but exhaust it over time. Exhausted attention leads to fragmentation. Fragmentation leads to misalignment. Misalignment invites collapse. The ancient stones do not warn of apocalypse. They warn of forgetting how to pay attention. That warning does not age. It becomes relevant whenever speed outruns perception. In every era of rapid change, humanity rediscovers slowness, not as luxury, but as necessity. When systems become too complex to grasp intuitively, slowing down becomes the only way to see clearly. The deep past was defined by slowness not by choice, but by circumstance. Observation unfolded over generations. Memory was cumulative. Knowledge was patient. Modern life compresses time. Feedback arrives instantly. Decisions multiply. Attention fractures. The nervous system struggles to keep pace. In this environment, ancient sites resonate not because they are mysterious, but because they are slow. They embody a tempo the modern world has nearly forgotten. Standing before stones shaped 12,000 years ago, urgency dissolves. Perspective widens. Personal anxiety shrinks against geological time. This effect is not intellectual. It is physiological. The body remembers how to settle when confronted with deep time. The builders may have intuited this calming power. They may have built not only to preserve memory, but to regulate collective emotion. In times of uncertainty, emotional regulation is survival. Panic spreads faster than famine. Fear destabilizes long before resources vanish. Göbekli Tepe stands as an early experiment in collective stabilization, a place where communities could recalibrate together, aligning not only with the sky, but with one another. Alignment is the quiet principle that holds the ancient worldview together, yet it is often misunderstood when viewed from the modern distance. It was never only about stars or solstices. Those were expressions, not the essence. The deeper alignment was relational, between humans and land, between action and consequence, between awareness and restraint. In the deep past, alignment was not optional. When people lost sensitivity to seasonal shifts, hunger followed. When they ignored animal migrations, scarcity arrived. When they settled where water once flowed but no longer did, abandonment became inevitable. Misalignment was not philosophical. It was immediate. This intimacy with consequence shaped perception. People learned to notice thresholds before they were crossed. Subtle changes in wind, unusual silence among animals, variations in the sky that signaled disruption ahead. Sensitivity became a form of intelligence. As societies stabilized and technology intervened, this sensitivity dulled. Tools buffered feedback. Distance grew between cause and effect. The world felt more predictable, even as underlying systems remained volatile. Göbekli Tepe belongs to a time when sensitivity still mattered. Its builders did not seek to master forces they barely understood. They sought to remain attuned to them. Their structures reflect listening rather than assertion. This may explain why the site does not dominate its surroundings. It does not reshape the land aggressively. It does not command the horizon. It participates quietly, as if aware that imbalance begins with excess. The eventual burial of the site can be read through this same lens, not as abandonment, but as withdrawal. When a place no longer serves alignment, it rests. It does not force relevance. This idea feels foreign today. We preserve everything. We extract meaning relentlessly. We rarely allow things to sleep. Yet the deep past suggests that dormancy is not loss. It is preservation. Awareness, like land, sometimes requires fallow periods. The builders trusted that what mattered would return when conditions allowed, that sensitivity, once cultivated, could reawaken even after long silence. That trust stands in contrast to modern urgency, and it asks an uncomfortable question: whether our refusal to pause may itself be a form of misalignment. In the end, the story carried by the earliest builders is not a secret to be uncovered, nor a puzzle to be solved. It is a stance, a way of standing in a world that does not guarantee stability, yet continues to offer rhythm. They stood without illusion of permanence, without the expectation that progress would protect them, without the belief that knowledge could outrun consequence. They understood something simple and difficult, that awareness must move at the speed of reality, not at the speed of ambition. Their monuments were not declarations of power. They were acts of memory, physical reminders that attention is not automatic. It must be cultivated, returned to, practiced again and again. Göbekli Tepe does not tell us what to believe. It does not tell us what will happen. It does not warn of apocalypse or promise renewal. It does something quieter. It reminds us that humanity has faced radical uncertainty before, that others have stood at the edge of changing worlds with fewer tools and greater vulnerability, and that their response was not panic but attention. Attention to the sky, attention to the land, attention to one another. In a time when speed fragments perception and certainty feels increasingly fragile, this ancient posture becomes unexpectedly relevant, not as nostalgia, but as orientation. The stones do not call us backward. They call us inward, toward patience, toward proportion, toward the discipline of noticing before acting. They wait without urgency, because urgency is a human condition, not a cosmic one. And perhaps that is the final lesson carried across 12,000 years, that what endures does not shout. It waits. That wisdom does not demand allegiance. It invites presence. The stones remain, not as answers carved in stone, but as a question still open. Are we paying attention now? Because attention, once remembered, is enough to begin again.